sacrifice He makes for us on the cross, the atonement He is for us. But it can't be neglected to also look at what Jesus says, what He teaches, what He expects of His disciples. And so we continue to hear from Jesus as we have since the beginning of the summer, where we've heard the Beatitudes, what it looks like to live a blessed life, what it means to be salt and light, what it means, what He has to say about anger and adultery and divorce and the promises that we make. And today we hear what Jesus has to say when we encounter situations in our life where we had the opportunity to retaliate. Listen to what Jesus says, Matthew 5, beginning in verse 38. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evildoer. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. And if anyone wants to sue you or take your coat, give your cloak as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the second mile. Give to everyone who begs from you, and don't refuse anyone who wants to borrow from you. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. And as we have been doing, we'll go through this just a few verses at a time. We'll start with this first one that Jesus gives us, Matthew 5:38, where He says this, you've heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Now, Jesus pulls that quote out of the Old Testament. What He's doing is basically what I do every Sunday. He takes a sermon, a scripture from the Bible, and he reads it. And then he begins to explain it. Well, this is the scripture he picks. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And in fact, this is a scripture that appears many different times in the Old Testament. An eye for an eye, or tooth for a tooth, something similar to that in many different places. James read one of them just a moment ago. So you hear it. You hear it for yourself from the Bible, from God's Word. So if we're thinking, this is God's Word, it becomes a little strange and difficult for us as Christians who read primarily through the lens of the New Testament. And we know God to be a merciful God. We know God to be a forgiving God. Why then would we find this in the Bible? An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Doesn't it seem kind of indicative? Well, it's difficult sometimes for us to understand that unless we have some context. So let me give a little bit of context. In the Old Testament, when this law was written down, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, keep in mind where Israel was at. Moses, who wrote this, had led the people out of slavery in Egypt. And now there's thousands and thousands and thousands. It's basically a nation's worth of people wandering out in the desert. And can you imagine a nation's worth of people without any rules? And when something goes wrong or there's a conflict in a relationship, what do you do at that point? Well, you do what's best in your own mind. You try to figure out what's best and just think it out on your own. So let's say I'm out there in Israel, wandering around in the desert before there's any laws, any rules, and someone comes and steals one of my sheep. Well, I think that's a pretty bad thing for them to do to me. So what I'm going to do is go back to my neighbor and I'm going to steal my sheep right back. Only since they stole my sheep, I'm going to kill a couple of their sheep. That'll teach them to try and come and steal my sheep from me. Well, then they realize that I've come and stolen my sheep back and killed their sheep, so they're going to come over and try and prove a point to me, and they may even take it up to the next level. They may not only kill my sheep, they might start killing family members they can find. And all of a sudden, the violence starts escalating because everyone wants to say, I want to make sure they don't have to mess with me. I want to amp it up a little bit more so they know I'm serious. And all of a sudden, we've got this vigilante justice system where the amount of punishment inflicted just continues exponentially to increase. It's a problem. And it's so in this context that God gives these rules, these systems of justice, these principles of justice where He says, no, it's not going to be like that. It's going to be an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. We're not going to escalate justice beyond what justice requires. No more punishment than what's due, no less than what's owed. The problem is, though, that when God gave this rule, He intended it as a societal rule and not necessarily a personal one. This was intended to be the principle of justice for the nation of Israel and not necessarily how do I get even with the people I don't like. But that's unfortunately the way the Pharisees began to take it by the time Jesus came around. Actually, it's the way a lot of people take it. someone gets mad at someone else and wants to get back at them, and they'll often say, well, then the Bible says eye for an eye, right? Tooth for a tooth. It becomes a system for us to get even. Well, it wasn't intended to be that way. In Jesus' time, people were taking it as a personal rule. And so Jesus begins to teach what it really is. And in so doing, this is what he says in Matthew 5:39. But I say to you, so he lays out the scripture first, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evildoer. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. The principle for Christian disciples is this. There's no room for retribution. There's no room for retribution in the life of the Christian. You know, my father taught me something, and maybe your fathers and mothers have taught you this too. I hear a lot where they say, when you're growing up as a little kid in the schoolyard, they say, son, I don't ever want you to start a fight. But if anyone ever hits you, if anyone ever starts the fight, then you finish it. You've probably heard that before. Well, I have too. I mean, I was taught that as a little kid as well, but here's the thing. It's a completely un-Christian principle. It just doesn't match with what Jesus says. Understand that Jesus is prohibiting personal retribution. Jesus isn't joking when he says, when someone strikes you, you turn the other cheek. Now, I realize that as I lay this principle out, and probably the people who are hearing Jesus would have wondered the same thing. You're thinking, well, that just leaves us in a society and in a world where we can't protect personal property and we can't protect our own personal lives. I mean, is that really what Jesus wants? And I said, well, no, not exactly. It's important to understand some of the things, some of the context of which Jesus is teaching. There is a way in which we can live in this world and maintain a security of property and a security of our own safety. One of the things you have to understand is that Jesus isn't talking to everybody here. Who's he talking to? He's talking to the people who have come to hear him. The people who know that he has something to teach. The people who want to learn how to live by him. He's teaching his disciples, not the rest of the world. He's teaching his disciples. And so, just because we live without acting with retribution doesn't mean the rest of the world won't. We may not retaliate, but other people will, and in so doing, there will often be justice. If you know much about your Old Testament, I'll give you an example. Think about when Israel disobeyed God, and they did it a lot, but especially as they got near the end, they were violating the most fundamental first commandment. You shall have no other gods before me. They were turning to other gods. They were worshiping false gods. And what did God do? Well, first of all, he took Assyria, a foreign nation, and used Assyria to come in and destroy Israel, to punish them. Assyria didn't care about God. They didn't even know who he was. And yet God used them to bring justice, to bring a discipline on his people. And it happened the same thing in the south with the nation of Judah, which is the southern part of Israel. Babylon didn't give two hoots about God. And yet God used Babylon to bring discipline on the southern kingdom of Judah. Point is this, just because the church isn't the people who inflict justice, doesn't mean God won't use somebody to do it. It's just not you. And why not? Why not the church? Why not the people of God? Why can't we be the people to bring justice? Well, here's why. Because Christians, you're called to be salt and light. You're called to be different in this world. Retaliation is what everybody expects. When someone gets wrong, the natural thing is to retaliate. That's what everybody expects. But you're called to be the people who are unexpected, to do things differently. Another realization that we have to understand, if we're going to understand how justice plays out, is we have to understand that God puts systems of justice in place. And so let's get back to the example. When you send your kid off to school and some parents will teach them, don't start a fight, but you can finish it. Well, you know what? If someone's harming your child at school, there's a system of justice in place. It's supposed to be the teachers that make sure this that justice is carried out between the children. And on a larger scale, in the family system, if you're a husband, you're supposed to make sure that there's, or a wife, you're supposed to make sure there's justice in your household. What about the government scale? The government is responsible for making sure that there's justice among its citizens. And when there is a wicked nation on the face of the planet, it's God's prerogative to bring justice upon those nations. So at every level, from the global national scale down to the schoolyard with children, God has put in place these systems of justice. And for us to take vengeance into our own hands is to usurp the very systems that God's put in place. It doesn't mean that you have no recourse. But what it does mean is that one of those means of recourse may not be striking back. Let's take a look at what Jesus says next in verse 40 through 41. He says, if anyone wants to sue you and take your coat, give your cloak as well. If anyone wants to force you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile. So let's talk just a minute about what's happening here. This is a context kind of thing too that's helpful. In Jesus' day, it was not so dissimilar to now, where you could enter into a lawsuit with someone. If someone felt wrong, they could sue you. And they could take your money away if they won that lawsuit. They could take a lot away. They could take almost everything away. But by law, there was one thing that they were not allowed to take. They couldn't take your cloak, the thing that was closest, the clothes that was closest to your body. So that way, you wouldn't be naked and exposed to the elements out on the street. So it was sort of a system of a very minimal sort of honoring of human dignity. To say, you at least get to keep your cloak. And with the other case, with the Roman soldiers, what we see is a law put in place in Jesus' time where a Roman soldier could compel anyone to carry anything for up to a mile. Up to a mile. You know, if you were to carry something for a mile, it would take you a little while to do it. But it wouldn't take you all day. And so it's an inconvenience out of your day. It's not really a fun thing to do, but it's also not terrible. And so what Jesus says here is that if someone sues you and takes everything that you own down to the very last thing that they can't take, go ahead and give them your cloak too. What Jesus says is if someone compels you to walk, even up to a mile, up to that legal limit, go ahead and go a 2nd mile. If someone wants to use the governmental power structure to take advantage of you, not only should you let them, but you should insist that your perpetrator take it to the embarrassing extreme. That way, everyone who sees it becomes aware of the injustice. Not just the people who see it, but even your perpetrator becomes aware of how unjust the system is when you take it to its embarrassing extreme. Matthew 5:42, Jesus says this, give to everyone who begs from you, and don't refuse anyone who wants to borrow from you. Now this is an interesting verse because the first 3 things that Jesus talks about are striking, if someone strikes you on the cheek, if someone sues you, or if someone legally compels you to work. So in each of those 3 instances, Jesus is speaking about what do you do when you're in the position of being the victim. Well, in this case, Jesus is shifting. No longer is he saying, what do you do when you're in the position of the victim? He says, what do you do when you're in the power position? What do you do when someone is begging from you? What do you do when someone wants to borrow from you? And maybe this is more important for us, because I think in our world, in our day and time, not to say we're never victims, but we're more often in the power position. So how do we respond? Well, I think one of the things that's easy to do if we're not careful, it's easy to read these verses of Jesus who says, give to everyone who begs from you and don't refuse anyone who wants to borrow from you. It's easy to read these verses through a political lens. To say, well, see, since Jesus wants us to give to those who beg from us, we should create a governmental structure that's able to give to those who would be begging. I want to ask you to avoid doing that. And here's why. Not because I'm necessarily against that. But there are plenty of other political theories and social theories that can justify a government that leans more socialist. And if you want to do that, there are great theories for that. But I would say don't use Jesus' words here because they really take his words out of context to put it in a political lens. Again, let me ask the question. Who is Jesus talking to? When Jesus is preaching the Sermon on the Mount, he's not on the floor of the Roman Senate. He's not talking to the emperor saying, we need to make Rome a more just government. We need to make Rome more compassionate toward its people. He's not talking to the Jewish synagogue saying, we need to make the function of the Israeli official systems work better for the Israeli people. Jesus isn't there. Where he is outside the city, on a mountain, talking to his people, his disciples. Now, you could make the argument and say, well, Jesus wants us, his disciples, to give. So wouldn't we be involved in systems that would continue to give? Well, maybe, but I don't think so, and here's why. First of all, look at where we come from in this text so far. First of all, Jesus says if someone slaps you and creates a system of injustice, what do? You suffer the injustice. If someone sues you and unjustly takes everything from you using the system, what do? You suffer the injustice of the system. If someone unjustly makes you carry their pack because it's part of the system and they're allowed to do it, what do? Not only do you suffer the injustice of the system, you take it another mile. Jesus' goal in this verse is not to change the way that systems respond to people. He wants to change the way that his people respond to the systems of the world. Now, I'm not saying that advocating for one form of government or the other, but when we are able to say that, look, the system is going to take care of you, it sort of gives us an out to say, now I don't have to. When we're able to point to someone else or some other program and say, they're the ones that we're invested in to take care of you, then it means that I don't have to touch you. I don't have to know you. I don't have to be with you. But I don't think that Jesus is interested in that. I don't think that Jesus wants to change the systems. I don't think that Jesus is in this to change the government. Jesus is in this to change you. He wants you, his disciples, to give to those who ask. He wants you, his people, when someone comes to borrow money from you, he wants you to lend to them. Imagine what the world would be like if every Christian around the world, the largest religion in the world, every Christian around the world really took these words seriously. And everyone who needed anything would ask the Christian, and the Christian would simply give it. No longer do we need systems of government to care for each other. Then do we? Because we've got our brothers and sisters in Christ willing to open their hands, willing to open their resources to care for one another. Jesus isn't in this to change governments. He's in this to change people. The good news of the gospel is that Jesus Christ suffered the injustice of the cross. He committed no sin. He died the death of a sinner. Did he have to? No. No. He's the Almighty God. He could have done anything. He could have completely wiped out that unjust Roman government and replaced it with one that was so much better. Took care of people way better than that. But did he do that? No. What did he do? He submitted to the injustice of the cross. Why? Why would he do that? For you. He did it for you. The good news is that he died the death that you don't have to. The good news is that in him, this is good news, in him you don't get justice. In him you get mercy. He took the justice you deserved and gave you instead mercy. And this is how we understand these verses. When we interact with other people, we don't have any rights, and that's tough for us, especially growing up with the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. It's important for us to understand that as Christians, not necessarily as Americans, as Christians, which is higher, we don't have any rights. All our rights are nailed to the cross with Jesus Christ. What we have when we interact with each other is mercy that we've been given from Jesus Christ. What we have when we interact with others is obedience. Which makes it easier, because when Jesus says, turn the other cheek, and give your cloak, and go an extra mile, and give and lend to anyone, He's not asking us to sacrifice what is ours. He's asking us to give away what is his. What he's earned on the cross when he has purchased us. May this word be to the glory